In late 1876, Clay Allison and his brother John were blowing off a little steam in a dance hall up in Los Animas, Colorado. Only problem was, when they got to town, they failed to check their firearms. Big no-no. And when a deputy sheriff by the name of Charles Faber tried to disarm them, Clay refused. So Faber left, at least long enough to grab a shotgun and a pair of locals to back his play. Thus armed, he returned, and as Clay and John were busting a move on the dance floor, Faber opened fire without warning, sending a load of buckshot into John's chest and shoulder. In turn, Clay whirled around, quick as lightning, and put a bullet straight into Faber's heart. The other two deputies took off running as Allison dragged the corpse over to his brother, saying, "John, here's the man that shot you. Look at the goddamn son of a bitch. I killed him." Now, believe it or not, John Allison would survive his wounds. And although Clay was arrested and charged with murder, a grand jury would ultimately find that he had acted in self-defense. But how well would his luck hold up a little later on when he came face to face with the legendary Wyatt Earp? Is it true that Clay Allison killed over 50 men? Was he really naked when he shot Deputy Faber? I didn't mention that, did I? And what about the story of him yanking out one of Doc Holliday's teeth? How accurate is that? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. By 1877, Clay Allison had already gunned down at least 3 men: Chunk Colbert, Pancho Grego, and Deputy Charles Faber. He also took part in the lynchings of Cruz Vega and Charles Kennedy. But that's it, just 5 men. Or at least that's as far as the official records are concerned. You know what they say about letting the truth get in the way of a good story, though, right? And there are a lot of unconfirmed stories out there regarding Clay Allison. For instance, legend has it that Clay and one of his neighbors got into an argument over a watering hole. One thing led to another, and they agreed to settle their differences by digging a grave and then having a knife fight to the death inside of the grave. Loser gets buried. Of course, Clay came out on top yet again, and he was even kind enough to say a few words over his neighbor once he finished covering him up. Apparently, Clay was partial to knife fights, as he allegedly fought 2 additional duels, to the death, up in what's now Oklahoma. He also possibly killed a ferry operator in North Texas in a similar fashion, with a Bowie knife. Just a few of the many stories that remain unproven, but they all help to contribute to Allison's deadly reputation. Hell, according to Bat Masterson, Clay had killed a total of 56 men. Others allege that it was closer to 21. But how true are these claims? Well, according to the Allison family, Clay himself only admitted to 8 bodies. We just mentioned 5 of them a moment ago: Colbert, Pancho, Kennedy, Vega, and Faber. But who were those additional victims? I do think it's likely that Allison drew blood during the Civil War. I also think there's enough stories about him getting in knife fights that there's at least a kernel of truth in there somewhere. Then, of course, we have the mysterious disappearance of Charles Cooper. Clay was indicted for Cooper's murder, but the charges were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Now, me personally, I've never been all that fascinated with body counts. And while Clay does get a lot of attention as a gunfighter, I do think it's worth taking a look at who he was as a man. You know, his mannerisms and just the general way he conducted himself. I'll give you an example. Allison may have been deadly, but he also enjoyed a good practical joke. A lot of times these pranks were harmless, like when he would switch out his cowboys' bedrolls when they weren't looking, or loosen the girth on their saddles. There's even a story about Clay forcing his own hands to perform ballerina dances around the campfire. Other times, though, the jokes were a bit more serious. Like when a cowboy bumped into him on accident. Clay pulled out his revolver right there in the saloon and began shooting at the man's feet, making him dance, just like in the cartoons. Cowboy returned shortly thereafter with a pistol of his own, and this time it was Clay's turn to do a jig. Only thing is, his leg gave out on the 4th shot, causing him to fall headfirst into a spittoon. Luckily for the cowboy, Clay took it all in stride, laughed it off, and bought him a drink. And then there's Dr. Manger over in El Moro. Guess the doctor favored a tall stovepipe hat, but for whatever reason, Clay absolutely hated it, to the point that he would actually knock it off the doctor's head every time he saw him. He warned Manger on several occasions to get a proper head covering, to no avail. Finally, one day when Clay was in his cups, he grabbed a shotgun and blew the hat plumb off the man's head. He then took the frightened doctor to the general store and bought him a brand new Stetson. Or at least that's how the story goes. See what I mean though, right? It's stunts like these that garnered Clay sort of a Jekyll and Hyde reputation. When sober, he was quiet, generous, and even polite. But just as soon as he got full of that drink, he basically turned into an ill-tempered loose cannon. Scariest part was, Clay didn't yell or bluster. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The more angry he got, the less he spoke. And when he fell completely silent, that's when it was time to worry. For the most part, though, Allison just enjoyed having a good time. He was also a bit of an exhibitionist. I can't tell you how many stories I found of him getting drunk and then stripping butt-ass naked and doing a dance. Matter of fact, at least one source claims that both he and his brother John were completely naked, save for their gun belts when they got into it with Deputy Faber over in Colorado. It wasn't all hedonism, though. On occasion, if the mood was right, Clay would even deliver sermons while drunk. Guess that was just a byproduct of being a preacher's kid. More than one story of Clay holding church in the saloon, Bible in one hand and a cocked revolver in the other. You'd even have the soiled doves singing hymns. Another Allison quirk that I found amusing was the fondness he had for his horse, whom he had named Black Raven. Clay had the pony so well trained that he wouldn't even tie him at hitching post. He just let him roam free and whistle when it was time to leave. He was also known to bring out buckets of beer and watered down whiskey for the horse. Allegedly. As with pretty much every other aspect of Clay Allison's life, it can be very hard to tell where the legend stops and the truth begins. Now, following the Colfax County War, Clay drifted for a spell. He'd eventually start a new ranch up in the Texas Panhandle, not far from Mobeetie, while also making frequent trips to Dodge City, Kansas. And on at least one of those visits, he had a very tense moment with a guy by the name of Wyatt Earp. Maybe you've heard of him. By the way, once again, there are numerous versions of this story, but if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and share the one that Wyatt himself told to a reporter in 1896. According to Earp, Allison arrived there in Dodge, drunk off his ass, and armed with, quote, a pair of six-shooters and a mouthful of threats. Straight away, I put my guns on and went down the street with Bat Masterson. Now, Bat had a shotgun in the district attorney's office, which was behind a drugstore just opposite of Wright's store. He thought the weapon might come in handy in case of trouble, so he skipped across the street to get it. But not caring to be seen with such a weapon before there was any occasion for it, he stayed there, talking to some of the people outside of the drugstore, while I went into Webster's saloon looking for Allison. I saw at a glance that my man wasn't there, and had just reached the sidewalk to turn to the Long Branch next door when I met him face to face. We greeted each other with caution, and as we spoke, backed carelessly up against the wall. There we stood, measuring each other with sideways glances. So, said Allison, you're the man that killed my friend Hoy. Yes, I guess I'm the man you're looking for, said I. His right hand was still around to his pistol pocket, but I made no move. Only I watched him narrowly. With my own right hand, I had a firm grip on my six-shooter, and with my left hand, I was ready to grab Allison's gun the moment he jerked it out. He studied the situation and all of its bearings for the space of a second or two. I saw the change in his face. I guess I'll go around the corner, he said abruptly. I guess you'd better, I replied. And he went. End of quote. Now that was not the end of this little confrontation. About a dozen or so what Earp described as the worst Texans in town were congregating outside of Bob Wright's store with Winchesters at the ready. At the time, Wyatt was unaware of their presence. He was actually headed that way when Bat signaled to him from across the street to stay out of range. That's when Clay Allison reappeared, this time mounted on his horse and hollering for Wyatt to come talk to him, to which Wyatt replied, quote, I can hear you all right here. I think you came here to fight with me, and if you did, you can have at it right now. Several friends of mine wanted me to take a shotgun, but I thought I could kill him all right with a six-shooter. At that moment, Bob Wright came running down the street to urge Allison out of town. He'd experienced a sudden change of heart because Bat crossed over to him with these portentous words. If this fight comes up right, you're the first man I'm going to kill. Allison listened to the legislature's entreaties with a scowl. Well, I don't like you any too well, he said, addressing Bob Wright. There were a lot of your friends to be here this morning to help me out, but I don't see 'em around now. Earp, he continued, turning to me and raising his voice. I believe you're a pretty good man from what I've seen of you. Do you know that these coyotes sent for me to make a fight with you and kill you? Well, I'm going to ride out of town, and I wish you good luck. And so Clay Allison made his exit. 10 days later, he reappeared within a mile of town and sent a messenger asking my permission to come into Dodge and attend to some business regarding his cattle. I sent him word that he was welcome to come so long as he behaved himself. He availed himself of the offer, and for 2 weeks he behaved like an exemplary citizen. End of quote, and there you have it. Now, for what it's worth, Charlie Siringo remembered things a tad bit differently. According to him, Clay was marching up and down the streets, guns in hand, and actively searching for Wyatt and his deputies, until eventually a friend talked him into giving up his guns and going to sleep. Per Siringo, quote, soon after, the city law officers began to crawl out of their hiding places and appear on the street. Not only was this story corroborated by another Dodge local, Chalk Beeson, but it was even referenced in a September 1876 edition of the Dodge City Times as, quote, a disgraceful row, in which it is said the officers failed to appear. By the way, that old boy who allegedly disarmed Clay was a fellow Texas rancher by the name of Dick McNulty. And yeah, this too was corroborated by Chalk Beeson. It's also worth noting that the guy Hoy, who was mentioned in Earp's account, was actually George Hoy. He had been killed there in Dodge a few months earlier. Per cowboy Pink Higgins, Hoy had, quote, been shot to death while shooting a pistol in the air in the streets of Dodge. He worked for, or at least was a friend of, Clay Allison. Other cowboys had been robbed, shot, and beaten over the head with revolvers, and the cowmen were indignant about it. It was stated that the marshals were all pimps, gamblers, and saloon keepers. They had the cowboys disarmed, and with their teeth pulled, they were harmless. If they got too bad or went and got a gun, they were cut down with shotguns. Allison was going to protest over the treatment of his men, and of course the salty Clay was willing to back his arguments with gun smoke. Pink also stated that Clay eventually did locate Wyatt Earp, Dylan Farrow, and told him in no uncertain terms what he thought of the way he had been treating the cowboys. Now, we'll probably never know what really happened, but if I had to go out on a limb, I'd say the truth is likely somewhere in the middle. I think Clay probably did get liquored up, and after hearing of the death of his friend Hoy, or maybe just the mistreatment of the cowboys, he went on the prowl for Wyatt Earp. As soon as Wyatt learned of Clay's intent, he went to go get Masterson and a few other deputies. By the time they got their arsenals secured and emerged from their holes, Allison had already been disarmed by McNulty and sent to bed. I don't think that Wyatt Earp or even Bat Masterson would have just hidden themselves out of fear. If anything, they were just waiting on Clay to sober up. I mean, why press the issue, right? Why kill or risk being killed when there's no need? And that's assuming this even occurred. Another thing to keep in mind is that Clay made a ton of visits to Dodge during this same period. I think historian Chuck Parsons summed it up best. Quote, from available evidence, it appears certain that Allison caused no trouble on any of his several visits to Dodge City. From available evidence, it appears that he was a man who visited for social reasons and for legitimate business reasons, but was never arrested or fined, or even caused any trouble. Certainly, even a minor altercation with Dodge City lawmen would have caused some attention in the contemporary newspapers, as well as there being some record in legal documents. Such is not the case. At the risk of seeming too much of a hero worshiper, the following will be submitted as having a grain of truth which may placate the pro-Dodge City lawmen followers. O.S. Clarke's small biography of Allison does contain recognized errors, but the following may have some basis in actuality. Allison went to Dodge City for supplies, with his guns on him as was his usual custom. When the marshal demanded and ordered Clay remove his pistols, Allison protested, stating that it would be as much as his life was worth to take him off for even an hour. After a conference on the part of the officials, they decided that he must be disarmed. When they gave Clay the ultimatum, he said to them, gentlemen, when these pistols go off, they will go off smoking. They knew they would have to kill him if they persisted in their action. This they did not want to do, so they reconsidered the matter and gave him the freedom of the city, and is told that he did not abuse the privilege in any way and left town in a decent and orderly manner. If such a confrontation did occur, there would naturally have been no arrest, no record in the police documents, and if it had been done quietly, there would have been no need for a newspaper reporter to discover the arrangement. Certainly the law of Dodge City was not above allowing weapons to be worn, especially if they were concealed. End of quote. And yeah, this kind of reminds me of the showdown between Wild Bill Hickok and John Wesley Hardin. I know everyone's got their own opinion on the matter, but I do think that Hickok just felt like it wasn't worth it. I can only assume that Wyatt felt the same way. I'm not sure if fear entered the equation so much as common sense. He might have gotten lucky and killed Allison, sure, or Clay might have killed him. Why force the hand, especially if Allison was otherwise on his best behavior? Most likely, Wyatt figured that the best course of action was just to leave him be, while at the same time keeping a close eye on him. Now, as intimidating as Clay Allison undoubtedly was, he was not invincible, as evidenced by him getting his ass thoroughly whooped over in St. Louis, around the same time that he had that showdown with Wyatt Earp. Per the July 25th, 1878 edition of the Missouri Republican, Clay went hunting a man by the name of Kessinger, saying that he had heard he was tough, but he wanted to find out for himself. Well, he found out all right. Kessinger caught up with Clay shortly thereafter and gave him a proper attitude adjustment. Or as the paper put it, Kessinger knocked him down and, quote, pounded him fearfully until he cried for quarter. Clay would give his own version of the fight to a Dodge City paper in February of 1880, and according to him, it was 3-on-1, and while he made no claims to being a pugilist, he was only slightly injured, and he did not, quote, squeal, as did my 3 opponents. My present residence is on the Washita in Hemp County, Texas, where I am open for inspection and can be seen at any time. End of quote. In other words, you should have seen the other guy. And if you think I'm lying about it, why not pay me a visit and tell me to my face, homeboy? Now, like I said earlier, Clay formed a ranch up in the Texas Panhandle. And for the most part, he just kept his head down and punched cattle, sort of like he had always done. And then, on February 15th, 1881, a 39-year-old Allison was wed in holy matrimony to a 19-year-old by the name of Dora McCullough. Per sources, Clay then spent the next month hospitalized after nearly being high-fived to death by all of his friends. No. In all actuality, the lovebirds had initially met way back in Colfax County. Matter of fact, Clay's brother John was married to Dora's sister. Guess they hit it off, and from there they eventually tied the knot. The ceremony took place in the Panhandle, and the newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Las Vegas, New Mexico. According to Clay's friend and future governor of New Mexico, Miguel Otero, quote, Allison had become a greatly changed man after his marriage. He was never again guilty of drinking to excess, nor becoming involved in shooting scrapes. Now, this period can be a little confusing, mostly due to it being so difficult to track Allison's various movements. He told that paper in Dodge City that he was living in Hemp County, Texas. He registered a brand in nearby Wheeler County, and by March 1881, the Las Vegas Optic claimed that Allison and his wife were living over in the Seven Rivers region of New Mexico. Only on account of the recent troubles, especially the aftermath of the Lincoln County War, they were looking to relocate. By the way, I did find one source alleging that Clay was actually living in the same house where Bob Ollinger killed John Jones back in, I think it was 1879. And yes, that's the same Bob Ollinger that was later killed by Billy the Kid. A lot of overlap between Billy and Clay Allison. So much so that I can't help but wonder if they ever rubbed shoulders. Clay was supposedly a friend of the co-cousins, Frank and George, and he did spend a lot of time over in Las Vegas. I've heard there's at least one story of Clay and the Kid hanging out, but then again, there's also stories of Clay meeting Jesse James, so who the hell knows? Whatever the case, Clay and his bride would eventually return to the Lone Star State, settle down on a ranch just north of Pecos. And just like Otero said, Clay did his level best to stay out of trouble. Hell, when the locals lobbied for the formation of Reeves County in the spring of 1883, Allison was among the leading citizens who signed the petition. Skip ahead to August 1885, and Clay's wife gave birth to a little girl they named Patty Dora Allison, which proved to be even more of a reason to stop getting into gunfights. Be that as it may, Clay did still have that dog in him, and by the following year he was back in New Mexico looking to put the screws to the Maxwell Land Grant and Railroad Company. Or at least that's the rumor. Allison denied the accusations and even made it a point to publicly distance himself from the Reverend McMains, whom he had been closely associated with during the Colfax County War. As to whether or not he ended up settling with the Maxwell Land Company, I honestly do not know. Now, during the summer of 1886, Clay drove a large herd of cattle from Pecos to Springer, New Mexico, and from there he shipped them via rail all the way to Rock Creek, Wyoming. Apparently, he had developed a toothache along the way, as he was next seen in Cheyenne consulting a dentist. Only problem was the jawbreaker ended up filling the wrong tooth. Just as soon as Clay figured out what happened, he grabbed a pair of forceps, forced the dentist into a chair, and then wrenched out one of his molars as payback. By the way, just like with Wyatt Earp, this dentist story does have several versions. One even claiming that the dentist was Doc Holliday, so grain of salt. As far as I'm aware, Doc and Clay Allison never actually met. But then again, they did both spend a lot of time over in Las Vegas, so it is possible. As far as yanking out that dentist's tooth, I do think it's something that Clay would have absolutely been capable of. Sadly, though, by the time he returned to Texas, he didn't have much longer in the land of the living. On July 1st, 1887, Clay loaded up a wagon full of supplies there in Pecos and set out for his ranch, about 50 miles to the northwest, or what's now the Red Bluff Reservoir. Only thing is, he never made it, at least not alive. And as is the case for pretty much the entirety of his life, even Allison's death is shrouded in mystery. The story that I've always heard is that he fell off the wagon drunk and one of the wheels rolled over his neck. His body was then found by a cowboy and taken back to Pecos. Depending on the source, Clay was either killed instantly or he lived long enough to ask that his boots be removed, stating, quote, "I've made up my mind to die with my boots off." Truth is, nobody knows what really happened. Rumor has it that he had recently been beefing with some neighbors over water rights. Apparently threats were levied and Allison was ready to settle the dispute one way or the other. He had even allegedly sent word ahead of time, letting the cowboys know that he was on the way to, quote, "kill them and cut their damned lying tongues out of their heads," end of quote. Another version is that it was his brother-in-law and ranch foreman, John McCullough, who Clay was looking to kill, on account of McCullough trying to take over his operation. That said, according to historian Chuck Parsons, quote, "the popular press has, over the years, written that Clay was roaring drunk at the time of his death, insinuating that because of his drunken condition, he was killed. Apparently, numerous writers felt as if he was drunk, then the final event would be considered more colorful. There is no evidence today that he had been drinking that day." Mr. William H. Drummond claimed years later that he had helped Allison load the wagon on the morning of the day he died, and said that Allison had not been drinking. It is unlikely that a responsible rancher, such as Allison was at this period, with the other evidence of his changed lifestyle, would choose this particular time to become intoxicated. The understanding of the Pecos community at the time of his death was that a sack of feed or some other item on the wagon started to slide off, and Allison, attempting to keep it on the wagon, lost his balance and fell under the wheels. Probably the wheel or wheels of the heavily loaded wagon passed over his neck or fractured his skull, causing death, end of quote. The following day, on July 4th, Clay was laid to rest in the old Pecos cemetery, nearly the entire town in attendance, testament to how respected he truly was. And it's there where Clay remained until August of 1975. That's when he was dug up and reburied at Pecos Park, just outside of the West of Pecos Museum. As far as I know, he is the only gunfighter to have his very own cemetery all to himself. Tragically, just 7 months later, Clay's wife would give birth to their second child, a daughter she named Clay Pearl Allison. One has to wonder if Clay even knew she was expecting at the time of his death. And I say tragically, just because Pearl would have to grow up without ever knowing her daddy. Thankfully, her mother did remarry a few years later to a highly respected doctor, so it does appear as if she and her sister were well cared for. A newspaper article, which was originally printed just days after Clay's death, summed up his life as follows. All of the old-timers knew Clay Allison. He knew no fear. To incur his enmity was about equivalent to a death sentence. He contended always that he never killed a man willingly, but that the necessity in every instance had been thrust upon him. He was expert with his revolver and never failed to come out first in the deadly encounter. Whether this brave, genteel borderman was in truth a villain or a gentleman is a question that many who knew him never settled to their own satisfaction. Certain it is that many of his stern deeds were for the right, as he understood right to be. End of quote, and I like the way they put that, as he understood right to be. Clay was just trying to figure this shit out, just like the rest of us. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Robert Clay Allison. Big shout out to Chuck Parsons, Donna Blake Burchell, and Corey Recco for their very diligent research. Got some links down below if you'd like to check out their books. Now before we go, I do have a very quick announcement. Something I've been wanting to do for a while now is to re-record the series that I originally did on Billy the Kid a couple of years ago. I was really proud of that at the time, but in all honesty, it was sort of a rush job, and you can tell, especially with the audio quality. Now that I've about got my audio dialed in the way I want it, I do think it's time to give that series a bit of a glow up. This will not be just a verbatim re-recording, okay? I'm going to be adding a lot of additional information that I left out of the original series, as well as a few clarifications and even some corrections. Look, we've all got our favorite characters from the Old West, and the guy that I just keep coming back to and keep reading about is Billy the Damn Kid. I can't seem to get away from him, so I really want to do his story justice. I also want to do it in a manner that I'm proud of, something that I'll be able to share for years to come. So yeah, that will be happening at some point in the next couple of months. When exactly, I'm not sure. It might be very soon, or it might not be until later on in the fall. As I recently mentioned, I am also working on scripts for Porter Rockwell, The Lost Dutchman's Mine, and the Dakota War of 1862. I also really want to do a series on Red Cloud's War and the Battle of Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee. I think those topics, along with the Billy the Kid series, and a few additional surprises I don't want to give away just yet, I think those will likely take us through the rest of 2025. With all of that in mind, I do not know if I'll have new material for you next week, or even the week after. I do have another long-form compilation I'm planning on releasing. I'm also going to combine today's episode with part 1 and release the Clay Allison series as just one long episode. And like I said, I do have a few surprises up my sleeve. So either way, please join me here next week, and I will have something for you. What exactly that will be, it's not exactly clear yet, but it will be something. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got. Until next time, adios.